WWF International. And we have Mustafa Kamal from the International Labor Organization. So delighted to have you here, Mustafa. You're a great addition to this panel. So I want each of the speakers to spend maybe 5 or 7 minutes, Joao might take a little longer, to talk about what's needed in the finance and investment sector to really drive real transition, to drive real change. Mustafa has a meeting, so I'm going to let you go first, if that's okay.
Yes, very well. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join the panel. I think it's a very important subject, and first for the International Labour Organization, which you know is a unique in the UN system in the sense that it is the only tripartite organization where the constituents are made of representatives of governments, workers, and employees. So therefore, anything that has to do with the world of work and the impacts on labor markets is critical. Now, when we talk of agriculture and food systems, as you've said, this is fundamental in the fight against climate change. But we have to take in our starting points the fact that agriculture is the largest employer around the world. 1 billion people work in agriculture, in small-scale farming, and earn their livelihood. So therefore, our effort has been to look at how a transition to sustainable agriculture and food systems can sustain jobs and livelihoods on the one hand, and tap into the massive opportunity we see for more and better jobs in the ecological transition. Our analysis at the ILO has indicated that moving towards low carbon and resource-efficient circular economies has the potential to deliver some 100 million new jobs by 2030. But at the same time, there is a risk of displacing some 80 million jobs. Now, we are still on a positive narrative because there will be a net gain in labor markets. However, that is conditional to policies that manage this transition. On the one hand, equipping the workers, the workforce to be able to move into new modes of production, so that we do that in agriculture and food systems as well. And then importantly, ensuring that we have reskilling, upskilling for potentially redundant workers to be entering other occupations. Because unfortunately, there is going to be unavoidable damage, a loss of jobs, income, and livelihoods. So this is why a comprehensive framework for a just transition is fundamental, looking at policies for skills development, enterprise policies, social protection, and social insurance, linking with mitigation and adaptation. Now, we have tested all what I've said in a study we've done in collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank, looking at investment in a low-carbon economy in Latin America and the Caribbean, and that takes us to still this positive narrative. They will be losing jobs in energy, some 7 million jobs, but 20 million plus jobs possible in food systems, plant-based food, and agroforestry and land use change. So this is again a positive narrative, but I just want to say that it will not happen by default. There is need to be aligning finance and aligning finance for a just transition, which is the missing piece in the puzzle here, both in the negotiations, in the existing climate mechanisms. None of them, GCF, JEF, Climate Adaptation Fund, has a dedicated financing for a just transition. So this is a gap that we must fill and get private finance flow in the same direction.
Fantastic, and you're right, it's not going to happen by magic. We need real clear policies and determinants from so many of these powerful players who are involved in this. So thank you so much. Helena, I'd love to turn to you now.
Great. Thanks very much. So I'm Helena Wright. I'm the Policy Director at FAIR, and we're actually an investor network focused on sustainable agriculture and food systems. And we're backed by investors with more than 45 trillion actually in assets. So we've grown quite rapidly in terms of the support from the investment community. And we provide research basically that shows investors what are the risks and what are the opportunities in terms of sustainable food systems. So be that climate, biodiversity, antibiotics, so on. I mean, this week we've actually launched an investor statement calling on the G20 governments to actually include agriculture emission reduction targets in their NDCs. And actually in our research, what we found was that 50% of the NDCs so far have emission targets for the energy sector, but actually none of them had clear and specific reduction targets for agricultural emissions. And that's actually really serious risk for investors as well, and creates material risks, because we know that food systems account for around a third of global emissions, and also the number one cause of biodiversity risk as well, which is something that investors are already very concerned about in terms of their investments. So, I mean, what we're here to do today is actually point out that investors are supporting the call for more sustainable policies when it comes to food systems, and investors are trying to reduce those types of material risks as well as avoid the tipping points in the climate system. And we have seen some progress this week. I think we've seen some methane reduction pledges, but at the moment most of those methane pledges have focused quite a lot on the energy sector, with agriculture being more of an afterthought at this stage. But we do need to see agriculture both on the resilience side in terms of building resilience to climate change impacts, and also the mitigation side being more front and center in the negotiations. That's actually quite important, because a lot of investors now, I mean, we've seen earlier on this week, around half of global assets have committed to net zero in their pathways. What we're lacking though at the moment is a clear pathway to reach net zero for agriculture and food. So another thing that we're actually calling for here today is a clearer roadmap and a clearer pathway. At the moment, there's no equivalent to the IEA net zero report that we've seen on the energy side. So could there be an equivalent of that report that actually shows us what is the pathway for food systems to not only align with climate goals and 1.5 degrees, but also with the nature protection goals that are so essential to maintain ecosystems, and also with food security and health as well. So what does that roadmap look like for the future? What are the key milestones that we need to achieve in terms of finance and so on to actually meet those goals? And finally, just one quick point is on the kind of tools and the solutions that we need to see more investment going into. I think investors are already investing a lot in sustainable food systems. A lot of the ones that we work with are trying to shift their investments more into some of the solutions, such as agroecology, regenerative agriculture, but also areas like sustainable protein. And diversification into sustainable protein has really been found to be a very good way to reduce risks across all types of risks. That means climate, biodiversity, antibiotics, food safety, etc. And there's a lot of solutions out there which require investment. So, I mean, investors can't do this by themselves. So what we're hearing is that we need policymakers to align the right incentives. For example, aligning agricultural subsidies as well, which we've seen obviously mentioned here today a couple of times in the earlier sessions. Once we see those agricultural subsidies shifting towards a more sustainable system, that will actually enable a just transition for the workers and for farmers to align with a more climate resilient and sustainable global food system. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helena. Joao, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Danny. Can you hear me? Yeah. I think throughout the COP, we have been hearing the same narrative. It's an important one. Food systems are a big part of the problem we're facing for nature and people and climate today. But we can't phase out food as we're trying to do with fossil fuels. So we need to really reshape the food systems and the food systems, because there are many, endogenously. We need to do differently. The way we need to produce food in a different way, we need to consume food in a different way, and pay attention to the diet's component associated with climate change, and massively reduce, if not stop, food loss and waste. So with these three things, production, being alert to production, consumption, and food loss and waste, we can be hopeful for a food system that begins to work for climate, for nature, and for people. So when we look at the value of food consumed today, it's about $9 trillion per year. When we look at the cost of the food systems, it's almost twice as much. It's in the order of 19, 20 trillion a year. So the food system today is net negative in terms of the hidden cost that it imposes on all of us, on climate and on nature. So we need to rethink the way that the financial flows and capital flows are going to this food system that really destroys nature, destroys health, to one that is reshaped to help rebuild nature, that rebuilds health. And we can't forget that 811 million people are excluded from this food system. So we need to incorporate them in massive amounts. 811 million people, we would have to bring like 100 million per year until 2030 to reach the SDGs. So we have no time to waste. We need to take bold and ambitious actions forward to deliver nature-positive food. Farmers and fishers need to be financially rewarded for maintaining and optimizing the services that their lands and waters can render to people and planet, without compromising the human right to healthy and nutritious food, but produced within the planetary boundaries. Currently, according to World Bank, and we heard on Saturday, only 5% of direct public support for agriculture explicitly targets conservation and other public goods. This needs to be changed. The rest goes to intensive agriculture, industrial production systems, which many times and very often destroy value to nature by the overuse of pesticides and fertilizers and monocultures of farms with limited agrobiodiversity. 75% of our calorie intake comes from 12 plants and 5 animals. That's it. Fish is not included in that. Seagrass is not included in that, or seaweed. I mean, we need to change this. And by adopting a small number of plants and animals, I mean, it's very little, because we begin to put pressure on ecosystems that need to be converted for the things that are produced today. We need to change that. We need to double, triple the amount of agro-biodiverse foods that we eat for our health and for the planet's health. On Saturday, again, there was a policy agenda for transition to sustainable food and agriculture through repurposing of public subsidies, so that farmers and ranchers, especially the poorest ones, can be helped and financed during this transition. There are 8 years ahead of us to do this transition if we need to deliver the SDGs. So there is no time to waste at all. This is a really good start. There were about 36 countries that signed up for 26 countries, I think, that signed up for that. But we need much more. They represent, these countries that signed up for this policy action agenda represent 11% of global emissions. What happens to the other 89? I mean, we really need to change things around. And there was also a commitment of 12 billion of funding and a commitment to strengthen deforestation-free and sustainable agricultural supply chains, including systems for transparency, traceability, integrity, and so on. Yet this money is solely to be used in forests. Most food that is produced today and traded come from grasslands and savannas, or what they have once been, since they're being converted at alarming rates. In Brazil, for example, I am from Brazil, I live in São Paulo, we have the Cerrado. The Cerrado functions like a sponge for the aquifers. It's the headwater, it contains the headwaters for 4 of the major watersheds in South America. Yet, the rate of destruction of the Cerrado is massive, and we don't hear much about it, and most of it is being converted to monocrops, and we need to change this. The Sahara is also the world's most biodiverse savanna, so I can brag about it a little bit since I'm from there and it's my home actually. So we need to invest on the regeneration and the recomposition of all degraded lands and restore all degraded ecosystems in oceans and rivers. So we have at WWF an explicit call for this COP, which is to repurpose agricultural subsidies so that they begin to work for nature, for climate, and for people. Danny, thank you very much. I'm over.
That was great. Thank you so much. Thomas, I want to make sure you feel included and part of this group, so I'd like to turn to you next.
Thank you, Danny. And thanks very much that I'm able to join online. I'm sorry, only sorry that I'm not still in Glasgow to be with you properly. Really great to hear my fellow panelists' interventions and agree with a huge amount of what's been said. I think as an investor, and we've heard a lot from private finance in Glasgow, I think it's really important that we all, as investors, recognize the interconnectedness of these challenges that we face. So, you know, there is a clear focus on climate, of course, and it's really welcome that biodiversity has had such a a significant presence within the discussions at COP, and that, of course, is essential as well. But also recognizing the interconnectedness of food systems, their impact on climate, their impact on biodiversity, and their impact on social issues and individual health. And that actually we know that we have these challenges that the food system presents, that we cannot achieve the climate and biodiversity goals we have without also transitioning the food system. We've got this challenge that the World Resources Institute identifies we need to feed more than 50%. We need more than 50% more food to feed 10 billion people by 2050, but at the same time need to cut 2/3 of the emissions from food systems production. So that riddle, that challenge, is right at the heart of this transition. How can we shift so that we are able to feed more people and as well as, I absolutely agree, respecting the planetary boundaries. You know, we're using 1.7 planets worth of resources a year at the moment, and we need to bring that back in urgently. But we also need to recognize, as we've already heard, that some people are going hungry, and we need to make sure that we also lift them and make sure that we feed everybody, and we have a food system that supports that. So as investors, we have to balance the risks and the opportunities of this transition, and we need to recognize that although, as I agree with what Helena said, there are opportunities for us to invest in solutions and diversify away from some of the more harmful practices. We also need to recognize that actually the economics here, there are market failures that are perpetuating and contributing to these crises. And climate change, of course, was described by Nick Stern as the greatest market failure in history. But there are other market failures here as well, in terms of some of those incentives we heard about. And these lead to challenges for us as investors, where we reach the limits of what diversification and better research and due diligence and even engagement with companies can do. And that's where, again, as we heard from Helena, we also need governments to step up and policy change. And one of the things that I have heard last week when I was in Glasgow and continue to hear is this cooperation between the public and private sectors. And we need this sort of new paradigm where we are trusting each other and working together. And that the feedback that the private sector is giving to governments and policymakers about what we need to be able to invest in the transition and finance the transition is matched with policy responses from governments that give us clear long-term signals as to where we should be allocating capital. So where we get those clear signals, and we've had a number of really positive collaborative commitments from governments over the past 10 days that help to give us those signals. that allows capital to flow. Once we have those signals, money will follow, because we know that there are huge opportunities for growth from the companies that are going to provide the solutions. And equally, just as we know in the energy sector that we have stranded asset risks, there are stranded asset risks in every sector and every transition. And knowing which those companies that don't have a credible plan to transition themselves to a more sustainable contribution to the food system, to the health and nutrition of the world's population, is absolutely critical. So we, as investors, we know we have this duty to act in the best interests of our customers. And that has to be understood in a holistic and interconnected sense as well, not just their financial best interests, but actually over the long term, those financial best interests are best served by a sustainable financial system supporting a sustainable planet, and not just us considering the risks to investment, but also the risks of our investment, and making sure that that double materiality paradigm is built into the way that we invest. And then the last thing that we need to do as investors is we have obligations towards the system itself. So we have to, where there are market failures, we have to call them out, and we have to seek change through our policy engagement. And we also, for our customers, have an obligation to put their money into a system that has integrity. And the market integrity of the financial system is critical, because we have, when people give us their money, their pension or their savings to invest, then we have an obligation to them to put it into a system that is actually supporting their long-term interests. So that balance with policymakers, with the signals from them, and then what we understand in terms of shifting the way that we're thinking our mindsets through engagement is absolutely critical. Back to you, Danny. Thank you.
Thomas, that was great. Wonderful. Pat, I'd love to turn to you now to talk about you're coming from a very different angle on all this, so I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. I think what I've been doing for the past 10 years or so, I think could have been pretty much entirely entitled Mobilizing Finance to Address Climate or Biodiversity while Ensuring Healthy and Sustainable Diets for All, which I think is the title of this meeting, one of the longest meeting titles I've seen all week. But that's exactly what we're doing. And basically, what I set out to do 11 years ago was basically try to figure out a way.
Could we get him a different mic, please?
To try to figure out a way to basically halt the collapse of biodiversity and turn back the clock on climate change without requiring government consensus or government involvement. Much as I would welcome that, I think we've seen for the past 25 years it's easier said than done. And the way that we approach it, first of all, was recognizing that the critical thing to do was to eliminate the use of animals in the food system. When people talk about food systems and climate or food systems and biodiversity, they're basically talking about livestock and the use of animals as a food technology. And so when I looked into what are the climate impacts of this technology, I realized that something that really hasn't been on the agenda at all. People talk about livestock are responsible for something like 17% of current ongoing greenhouse gas emissions, but what is left out of the conversation is the opportunity for massive negative emissions. And that's because, unlike fossil fuel emissions, livestock emissions are almost entirely reversible. The CO2 in the atmosphere, it's about a third of all the carbon dioxide, anthropogenic carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today came from livestock operations, almost entirely due to land clearing, the biomass that was converted into CO2 in order to make land available for feed crops or grazing livestock. You see that happening in the Amazon today. That's been happening historically. And the total amount of CO2 that was released in the atmosphere that way was equivalent to 22 years of current fossil fuel emissions. So effectively, if we could reverse that process, it would be removing 22 years worth of fossil fuel emissions equivalent. The other factor there is that two other gases from animal agriculture, methane and nitrous oxide, are decay spontaneously. So as soon as you stop emitting them, you get negative emissions. And I've calculated that if over the next 15 years we could phase out animal agriculture globally, the negative emissions that would be unlocked would, over the next, through the end of the century, create negative emissions equivalent to 34 years of current total greenhouse gas emissions. It would be the equivalent of not just turning back the clock by 34 years because those emissions are increasing, but 34 times this year's total greenhouse gas emissions pulling out of the atmosphere through the end of the century. Okay, that's what motivated me to do that. And of course, livestock are almost entirely responsible for the collapse of global biodiversity. So the way I approach it was to recognize that livestock are not part of nature, much as the industry would like them to portray them as such. They're just in terms of the food system, they're just a prehistoric technology that has been massively scaled as a way to produce meat, fish, and dairy food. It's incredibly inefficient by any measure, resource inefficient, but also capital inefficient. And that creates an opportunity for basically a subversive business, you might say. So I founded a company called Impossible Foods because I felt that it was entirely possible to develop a technology that outperforms livestock in every way that matters to consumers: deliciousness, nutritional value, affordability, convenience, and so forth. And that premise was sufficiently credible that to investors who are not investing in climate and environment, they're investing in making more money, basically, that we've been able to raise a lot of money. I don't know whether I'm able to say how much, but anyway, enough to get pretty far down the road. And we now have essentially proven the thesis of that technology platform, that we now have 4 products that we've created that in large consumer tests with meat consumers have been preferred on deliciousness alone over their animal counterparts. And in the most recent case, which is chicken, it was rated as tasting more like chicken by a food more like chicken than the chicken. And that's not as paradoxical as sound, because the chicken's not trying very hard to taste like a chicken. Anyway, so I think it's doable. What you need to do to mobilize finance is to create a value proposition for investors. And given that the market that we are addressing with our technology is currently, the scale of that market is $2 trillion a year, it's obviously rewarding for investors. There's another, just one more thing I'll say is that a lot of people raise the question, well, what will happen to the livelihoods of people who are earning a living in agriculture? And I think that's the last thing we want to do is to harm them. But there's a real opportunity, actually, that hasn't been discussed, which is that if you look at the total income that farmers in animal agriculture make annually, it's on the order of $1 trillion. The total scale of the market for meat and dairy products and so forth is $2 trillion, but much of that is profit to the downstream processors. So $1 trillion a year is less than 2% of the GDP of the G20 countries. If there were a fund created that essentially paid farmers to nurture the recovery of healthy ecosystems rather than chasing cows around, there would be no problem with well, we can take it offline. We can that basically that would over the next couple of decades, like I say, turn back the clock on climate change, give us a 30-year pause in the progression of greenhouse gas emissions, pull out 34 years of ongoing fossil fuel emissions, restore nature in 40% of Earth's land area where nature has been replaced by livestock. And I think that's a very plausible thing to do. Now, that's not a private enterprise approach, but there is actually a business model for it too, which we can talk about.
Great, Pat. Always provocative. Lots to unpack there. Zituni, I give you the final word on this portion of the panel. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, all I heard about investment, there is nothing that I disagree with. And I think there is a lot that we already know in terms of narrative. But for me, there is one huge investment gap that we don't talk about, and I don't think we're really giving much attention to. And to illustrate that, let me just tell you a short story that happened to me a couple of days ago. So I was at a dinner, nice dinner, nice people around, and then the food comes, starter, fresh bread, a plate with nice pieces of butter, really nice tasty butter. So we had a chat, we finished. You want to bring the next meal? And I asked the waiter who took, the leftover away, and I asked, what are you going to do with this butter? And she said, we're going to throw it away. So there was a plate that no one touched, really nice, delicious butter. And I said, what can you say? I mean, it's not her responsibility. Someone made the decision, says, all the plates you put there, you bring them back, throw them away. Okay? But that's immoral. I mean, it's food that is, delicious, and it's really suitable for consumption, and we throw it away. Why? So the point I'm making from this story is we're not investing enough in people.
Right.
I think our mindsets are completely in a different direction to the narrative we're talking about. We talk about investment in nature, in energy, in all these things that we use, and we are using them very badly. We waste a lot of natural resources, water, energy, food, you name it. So I think when we talk about investment, we shouldn't forget about the end users is us. We are responsible. If there is a third of emissions coming from agriculture, where's that coming from? It's our lifestyle, it's our consumption. So the point I'm making is, we can't just keep talking about investment in nature. They're all important, of course, but we have to connect with that. We have to make sure that our lifestyle, our mindset is also transformed. So transforming agri-food system doesn't mean just transforming the landscape and the nature and the production, but the consumption aspect is critical, and we are there, particularly in the consumption side. So that's the point I want to make.
That's a fantastic point. Thank you so much. And sort of, Mustafa, on that point of investing in people, we've heard a lot at COP and the side events and other events that have been happening this week that everyone deserves a healthy and sustainable diet, but we talk less about everyone deserving a really healthy, sustainable job. And I'm wondering how we can better connect through finance and investment those two things, that the diet side as well as the sort of economic and job side.
Thank you very much, and I just want to echo what has been said by the FAO about investing in people, because we have to keep reminding ourselves that the Sustainable Development Agenda is an agenda for nature, people, and the economy. Now, I just want to give an illustration. This year, the ILO worked together with WWF to look at the potential returns on jobs of investing in land rehabilitation, various ways of nature-based solutions. And that takes us to the part on the solutions. And our effort was to find that to find out to what extent a dollar invested in various ways of nature-based solutions would deliver on jobs as a core benefit and dividend. So what we found is that $1 million invested in agroforestry, land restoration, rehabilitation can deliver between 200 to 600 jobs per million invested. Now I want to put that in perspective, and I want to look at data from the International Energy Agency. The IEA studies are on job return per $1 million invested in energy efficiency, in transport and mobility. I looked at manufacturing, but in all those industries, the return on employment ranges between 6 to some 15 jobs. Our range is 200 to 600. So it tells us that nature-based solutions in land rehabilitation, ecosystem restoration has a much larger potential for employment creation. So these are very labor-intensive approaches. It is essential at the moment where we are in a job crisis. Let us remember that with COVID-19, some over 200 million people lost their jobs, and millions of workers went into what we call working poverty. The people working every day but still remaining within $2. So working poverty has increased around the world. So it's essential that in all the solutions that we look into, to keep the human dimension, the employment, the income part, because that is what is essential for people. We all are for climate action, but at the end of the day, people want a livelihood. They cannot act for the climate if they cannot survive themselves. So again, as my colleague from the FAO said, let's bring it back to investing in people and finding solutions that are aligned with human welfare and human livelihoods.
Absolutely, and investing in people pays off. It pays off for the environment, it pays off for the economy. There's so many wins there. Zatuni and Joao, you are the only people I think I've heard this week talk about food waste. And you know, we're in the United States, everyone talks about food waste. We all talk about it, we do very little to prevent it. And I'm wondering from your perspectives what the investment and finance community can really do to make sure that we are not losing food through post-harvest losses and that we are not wasting food at the retail and consumer levels. Would you like to go first?
Yes, absolutely. Let me give you some examples that involve private sector and charities as well. So in many countries, I'm not sure about the US, but at least in Europe, there are a number of countries who made it into a law to ban supermarkets from throwing food away and to have alliances with charities so that food is brought to people who need it rather than throw it away. Because, you know, you have the sell-by date, etc. But there is a lot of perfect food there that actually, you know, shouldn't be thrown away immediately. And this is a very good example that proved to work, and it should be really, you know, applied across the board. You know, we shouldn't throw food away just like that, just because there is a date on it that says, you know, throw it away because it's not best to consume today, but it's still fine and consume. So these are some of the examples. So you need regulation sometimes to help people, to help consumers, and involve others who are also having an important part in avoiding that waste of food. And then you have also young entrepreneurs who develop just simple apps that allow people to say, okay, I have some leftover food, and those who say, yeah, I'll come and collect it. It's the same thing, and it says there is a lot of innovative ideas like that, and we have to do more of this. But the bottom line of this is we have to stop throwing food away. In the first stage, not to acquire more food than we need. And it's really not complicated. You know, if we think about it and be more responsible, you can do it. You know, rather than say, you know, eat by your eyes, or, you know,
Right.
try to and it's a habit. It's a habit you get used to, and then you have to educate about it. at home. That's where the education starts. And at school, you know, and the kids who are 8, 10 years old now, when we talk about the target 2030, they're going to be 20 decision makers, and you know, by then. So if we don't tell them from now what they need to do from now to reach the target, then we're failing.
Right.
You know, it's not only us who are taking decisions now; they will be involved in that.
Absolutely. Thank you, João.
Yeah, I'll take, so Zitouni focused a lot on the consumers. I could not agree more that food waste is immoral. It needs to stop, period. But let's talk a little bit about food loss, because food loss is a completely different thing, okay? So to me, and this is generally not talked about, climate change is impacting productivity of some crops, and there are losses of about 12% in productivity just due to climate change. So to me, that is a type of food loss. Not only that, not only the quantity, but there are peer-reviewed papers that have proven that climate change is also diminishing the nutritional value of foods. So when we talk about food loss, I mean, we are producing crops, we are growing foods, but they deliver less content, nutritional or yields. So we need to address that. We need to give also farmers, especially the poor ones, the enabling conditions to prevent loss after the harvest or during the harvest and after. I mean, climate change is impacting in major ways the ability of farmers to go through the entire harvesting season from planting and collecting. This is causing poverty or making poverty more acute. So I think these aspects of food loss need to be talked about, because when we generally we talk about, we bundle food loss and food waste in one package, we tend to go with what is more obvious to us as consumers. But there are people out there that are losing their plantations, that are losing their livelihoods, and this is only increasing with climate change.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Thomas, Helena, and Pat, you all talked about government in different ways. And so Thomas and Helena, you talked about the need for government to really make it more conducive for investment, to remove those the subsidies that make it impossible for the the sustainability in the food and agriculture sectors we need to have to come about. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are. That sounds great, right? Remove those destructive subsidies, incentivize farmers and investors with different things, but it's very, very difficult to achieve that. And Pat pointed out that government hasn't achieved consensus on these issues for the last 25 years. So I'm wondering if all three of you can sort of talk a little bit about what needs to happen from the government side to make your jobs all easier.
Thanks. Yeah, happy to say something about that. I think in terms of what government can do, obviously investors are trying their best to sort of invest in a more sustainable food system, but we really need to see the policies and the regulation aligned as well as the subsidies. In that regard, it is promising to see some countries, even this week committing to repurposing agricultural subsidies and reforming them in line with climate and with nature. I think what we need to see more consideration of is the just transition to a sustainable food system. We've already seen a big discussion on this topic in the energy sector, and we've even seen funds created that support, workers and producers to produce in a more sustainable way. We haven't yet seen that discussion for the agriculture sector and the food sector. So what does that look like in terms of jobs, in terms of reskilling, repurposing? And if there's funds like that created, I think also the public and private sector can work together on sort of the transition to a more sustainable food system. There is a lot of investors and capital looking for sustainable things to invest in, as you know, so blended finance can be a really useful tool for that. And we also need to see the regulatory environment. So, for example, supermarkets and retailers getting those incentives right as well. And just to give one example from our work as FAIR, so we run a 17 trillion investment basically calling on the largest global food retailers and producers to basically set science-based targets and also to diversify into sustainable protein. And we need to see the incentives aligning in policy to actually support that transition as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Pat, why don't you go next and we'll turn to Thomas.
Okay, I'll just make a quick statement about the waste thing, though, is the large waste
Maybe hold it a little further away too.
It's the battery's wonky. The large majority of food waste is feeding crops that are using valuable land and water and inputs with horrible inefficiency to try to turn them into meat and dairy. Just to give you a measure of that, this year's soybean crop, which is grown on less than 1% of Earth's land area as opposed to more than 40% for livestock, that soybean crop contains 50% more protein than all the meat and dairy produced globally, okay? So that just gives you an idea how massively wasteful using livestock is in the food system, massively more than all the grocery waste and post-consumer waste put together by far. So in terms of government incentives, again, I want to just point out that the total annual income of farmers globally in the livestock industry is on the order of $1 trillion US. And that's less than 2% of the GDP of just the G20 countries. If they were to put together a fund that doesn't compel farmers to do anything, but offers them payment for restoration of ecosystems, and in the process, the potential for climate change is to pull a 22 years worth of total fossil fuel emissions, not to mention the methane nitrous oxide. That would be a total win-win. It's a relatively small, it takes care of the livelihoods of farmers and rural communities, and at the same time, a huge solution to climate change and biodiversity.
Absolutely. There's no doubt that farmers need to be paid for the ecosystem services they provide that really benefit us all. Thomas, before we turn to questions from the audience, you get the last word.
I just want to build on the idea of investing in people because in terms of your question on government and also the points that have been made around food waste, there's a huge amount of education that needs to go on of individuals, but also both in terms of how they interact with their governments. So, actually the power of people to influence what their governments are doing and making sure that they know that actually these things matter to me and I'm going to vote in accordance with my principles on this will make a huge difference to the ambition levels that we see from our governments and policymakers. And the same is true of people in my industry, that if we see individuals, there is $50 trillion US in the global pensions pots around the world. If that money, the people who, and it's individuals' money and individuals with principles and conscience, and if they get in touch with the likes of us and say, actually, I want my money invested in a way that is sustainable over the long term, that brings these just transition ideas that we've heard discussed in terms of transitioning jobs and so on, so that you say to every company you give money to, what's your plan? What's your plan for your workers? What's your plan to bring your company within planetary boundaries? What is your plan to be part of a 2030 economy, a 2050 economy, and ultimately an economy that is back within a sustainable system, so we're not undermining the future that we all want to retire into by the way that our money is invested. So investment in people so that they understand these things and know what agency and influence they have is a crucial part of the puzzle as well.
And I'm so glad you brought up pension funds. There's so much money that could be used for really wonderful things that we're not utilizing. So thank you so much. We have a few minutes for questions, maybe 2 or 3. If everyone can be quick and our answers can be quick, right here. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Prashant Vazay. I work at Climate Bonds Initiative. I do a project which is looking at restoring agricultural resilience in Indian agriculture, and I was really looking for solutions from the private sector here. So, typically, this is government spending, either by Indian government or bilateral aid, and it's in relatively small capital items like tree planting, agroforestry, watershed development, and there's far more need for investment than is possible for Indian government and these bilateral agencies to provide. I'm just wondering what kind of solutions the panel have on this, and thinking about Tom in particular, because there are multiple market failures about community assets, perverse agricultural subsidies, etc., etc. Just any ideas you've got would be great.
Great question. Tom, would you like to take it?
Actually, see you again. Yeah, I think there's a lot in that. I think as we see more and more of the finance system and private companies putting out these net zero commitments, we need to align. The next step, which we're going to see in the UK, and hopefully that'll be a model for others, is the idea that you have a transition plan and you say what your plan involves, and that will both include what you want to be investing in, so giving the kind of the indication of finance available, and also things like, when you mentioned the market failures, the policy conditions we want to see from government as well, and providing that information in the transition plans, creating that kind of positive feedback mechanism is one way that we can hopefully bring public and private closer together and working together, whether it's blended finance, as Helena mentioned, or other innovative solutions to leverage the amount of private capital that's committing to sustainable investment.
So much. One more question from the audience.
Hi there, Ian Black. I'm a professor of sustainable consumption quite locally at the University of Stirling. My reading of the last 30 years of social science is that capitalism is the problem here, that finance cannot be trusted. Do you really expect us to trust Credit Suisse? Do you expect us to trust Barclays? The system, what we can, the science will tell us, is that all of these ideas will be co-opted and they will fail. So my question is actually to the members of the industry who I think should be coming into these conversations on bended knee and asking for forgiveness. How much of your billions that you've got is going to be invested in loss and damage for the damage you've caused over centuries?
Helena, I don't know if you want to take that a little bit on. I mean, it's a very complex question, a very complicated one, very controversial. Do you have a mic?
So we're actually a non-profit organisation that works with investors that are interested in sustainable finance to basically help them engage with the companies that they own to basically invest more sustainably. So we're basically supporting the people within the investments who want to actually shift their investments and address those types of material risks, such as climate, biodiversity, food safety, and so on. So, I mean, what I would say to that question is you raise a good point, which is loss and damage, and that is that the investors and, insurance sector, etc., they won't be able to clean up the damage a lot of times, and there has been a lot of focus on, say, insurance solutions as a solution to the climate finance, to the climate crisis. But I mean, what I've been hearing as well is the investors calling on policymakers. Ultimately, when the system collapses and there's a collapse in ecosystems, the public sector is usually the one to clean up the mess.
Thank you so much. Did you'd like to comment?
Unless you're seated in a room with appropriate distance. While eating or drinking, we are medically exempt. Thank you for your cooperation.
Okay, I just want to make one point really in relevant to the question that you asked. The situation we're in now, and let's just take the example of what's happening with COVID, that it showed that actually everything is interconnected. And if one thing happened here, it affects everyone. And I think this is about time we start really applying that across the board with investment and everything else, because that affects our lives, affects everyone. And I think with climate change is the same. And I don't know if you heard the UK government chief scientist a couple of days ago who said, the damage from climate change is going to be much more than from COVID. And I think many people are not waking up to this reality. The science keeps ringing the bell all the time, the IPCC report after report after report, but we people don't seem to understand that. We think, 2030, 2050, it's still, but climate change is here. We're not going to stop it. It's going to continue. The point is, how can we avoid the danger of it? So my point is, we all have to take that responsibility to think that this affects everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Helena, I'd like to give you the last word, if that's okay, to just sort of sum things up.
Yeah, so it's been a really interesting discussion and a lot of debate on the panel. But I mean, what this is really about is sort of avoiding an ecosystem collapse and avoiding the collapse of ecosystems that we rely on for our food, for our lives, you know, water systems, all of these systems. And I think that's a really important point to mention, because while we're at the UN climate conference, obviously, it's important to note that climate change is really only one of the many planetary boundaries. There's a lot of other planetary boundaries that are affected by food systems, and we really need to address the kind of interlinkages between systems and see food systems as actually really critical to this. And that's going to be important not just for sort of the investors, the finance, but citizens, for farmers, and for people around the world. So
Thank you so much. Excellent summary. I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank all of you who've been watching online, and thanks to all of you who've been in the room. It's been great discussion, and I look forward to digging into this more. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.